Great. Can you all see my slides okay? Charlie, can you see the slides? Cool. So thank you to everyone that's here to see my talk. So I'm Henry, and welcome to my defense talk, which is titled Modeling Humans at Rest with Applications to Robot Assistance. So first, here's a COI statement that I'm required to show. This is related to a project that I worked on for a mobile robot that can provide caregiving assistance. And here is an outline for the topics I'm going to cover today. So first, an introduction, and then I will discuss 3 sections of work related to modeling humans at rest and inferring their pose and body shape using multiple types of sensor data. The code and data for this work is all publicly available, so if you want something specific, just ask and I can direct you to it. Great. So back when I first started in the healthcare robotics lab in 2016, actually 4 years before that even, a central motivation of my work was to help people like my Uncle Henry Evans, who spends most of his life in bed as a result of having a stroke. And here's a video from one of our lab studies showing a PR2 robot moving autonomously to help Henry wipe his face. The base of the robot moves as close as it can, and then Henry uses his computer to teleoperate the robot's arm. If robots could provide better assistance in bed, people would be able to live more independently. And people, next slide. And people in general spend a large portion of their life resting and in bed. Machine perception for this class of human activity would be beneficial to numerous applications, such as enabling robots to provide nursing care. There's some noise. Do you all mind muting your mics? Sorry. Maybe I could try to mute everybody. Okay. All right. I will continue. Thanks. So, machine perception for this class of activity would be beneficial to many applications, such as enabling robots to provide nursing care or monitoring patients in the hospital. And fulfilling these needs through technology could have a tremendous real-world impact. For example, giving a person a bed bath with a robot or helping them to get up in the morning. But the problem is really hard. Just look at all the occlusions in this picture that impede sensors from gathering information about the person. This work in my thesis uses unconventional sensor types to mitigate this occlusion, and it introduces new methods of machine perception for resting poses to infer the person's pose and body shape when it's occluded. Most existing research related to modeling human pose focuses on active poses. And examples of this include human pose datasets, models of arm dynamics, and how people walk. And there's a lot of diversity within the active poses that these cover, but it's actually quite different from the resting poses that people spend most of their lives in. People spend about a third of their lives in bed, usually much more than that for people with disabilities and older adults. And that is the class of pose that my research focuses on. So resting poses are really a different class of pose than active ones because they lack physical exertion and they have substantial contact with the surface underneath the person. Usually they're in scenes where heavy occlusion is present, which makes sensing hard. And furthermore, there's very little data available that represents resting poses, which presents challenges to training modern deep models that require a lot of data. An important problem that can benefit from having human pose data is markerless 3D human pose estimation. And there's various uses for this kind of technology in healthcare, from inferring characteristics of a patient in the hospital to commanding a mobile robot to help a person in bed, like with Henry. This typically involves using a supervised machine learning model to infer human pose from some kind of a sensor image. And so I want to provide a brief background here on machine learning. So this kind of model inference is learned using a training data set, and then the model is evaluated using a testing data set that it hasn't seen before. If the training data isn't sufficient, it won't perform well. And for training modern deep models, we need a lot of data, and this is a big challenge. We have a few options for collecting data at this scale. We could annotate existing data, such as gathering images from YouTube or Google and tagging them with key points for the joint positions. But this data is hard to come by, and annotation methods don't work very well when there's so much ambiguity. And such data almost entirely consists of RGB images, which aren't sufficient for inferring pose in this kind of scenario, even if you do have good labels. We could collect a lot of new real data, but this can be very time intensive. And to get accurate labels, it's important to capture each pose with and without occlusion, so that we can annotate the one in this example without blankets, and then do inference on the one with blankets. This is tricky, but a recent dataset actually provides it. However, it has a limited number of samples, which isn't ideal for training deep models. But instead of that, we could generate training data at scale using simulation, where everything is observable. And this could be used to complement the real data and make the deep model perform better. But this requires building an accurate model of the bed environment, which is full of soft materials that are challenging to model. And it also requires an appropriate representation of the human resting in the presence of these soft materials. Nevertheless, we choose this option and even show that some models can be trained entirely using synthetic data if the data has enough fidelity. So let's think about people at rest. These paintings help to illustrate what's important to model about people at rest. And two key characteristics among the subjects in the paintings is that they lack motion and they also lack physical exertion. We then created a simulation model to produce poses with these same characteristics by using this articulated ragdoll body and dropping it onto a soft bed. When the body reaches static equilibrium, it can be considered a resting pose. Soft materials like a mattress and blankets are notoriously challenging to model, but with state-of-the-art simulators, it's possible. And it's also possible to collect this data very quickly and to generate a lot of it, like tens of thousands of samples within a day or two. Our simulator not only produces resting poses, but also sensing data for unconventional modalities such as depth images and pressure images that mimics information produced by real cameras and physical contact sensors. Works on human pose estimation in bed have used quite a few different sensor types because of this occlusion. I mean, RGB, depth, thermal, infrared selective light, and pressure images. And given the heavy occlusion that's common in bed, each of these modalities has its pros and its cons. We constructed a system to sense people in bed that collects data from most of these modalities. It's got cameras mounted onto a frame that face toward the surface of the bed, capturing the view of the person. One of those is the Microsoft Kinect, which collects RGB, depth, and point cloud information. For those of you not familiar, an RGB image is like a regular camera image, and a depth image is also collected by the camera, but each pixel in the depth image is a measure of distance between the camera and some object or surface in space. So in this picture on the top right, the darker parts of it are closer to the overhead camera. We also placed a flat fabric pressure sensing mat on the surface of the bed to sense the person, and this produces pressure images. And in comparison to cameras, these are much less sensitive to visual occlusion. However, all of these sensors and these images have features that can be used to estimate the person's pose in bed. Human pose estimation has been explored by a lot of people in computer vision. So let's take a look at a couple notable examples in recent history. And one of the first ready-to-use methods for this uses random forests to infer 3D human joint positions from a depth image. And this was released around the same time as the Microsoft Kinect in 2011. Around 2015, deep learning with CNNs led to a major shift in the vision community. So a CNN is a convolutional neural network. This is a large model that can learn complex mappings from vision data, like this example. And a notable example that uses CNNs to infer pose is OpenPose, which superimposes a 2D skeleton model onto a person in an RGB image. Recently, improved human models, like the simple 3D parametric mesh, have offered a better representation than a 2D skeleton for pose estimation. But this also makes the problem more challenging. And here's a work from last year that infers this full 3D mesh onto video feed. And this is the simple mesh. And this simple mesh plays an important role in the research I'm going to discuss today, so I want to quickly introduce it. So this is a publicly available 3D mesh model that represents a wide variety of human poses and body shapes. It's compatible with deep networks, and it has an articulated version that can be used in a dynamic simulator. It's parameterized with joint angles such as the shoulder, a global pose for where it is in space, and it has 10 body shape parameters, and there's also versions for different genders. The input parameters then adjust the kinematics of it and produce 24 joint positions in 3D space, a collection of mesh vertices, which you're seeing here with this blue body, and even the height and the body weight of the body. It's a very useful tool. So now I'm going to cover some of my early work in this area, which is on inferring human pose in bed from contact pressure. In this work, we showed that deep learning can be used to infer a 3D skeleton model of a person in bed from a pressure image. Now, with how widespread deep learning is, it may seem obvious that this kind of thing would work, but it was less so in 2017 when I worked on it. This is done on a configurable bed, like many of the ones used in healthcare, and in the picture, the bed is in a seated configuration, and our model outputs a skeleton in a seated posture. Our deep learning method employs CNNs for supervised learning. We train the CNN on a data set that has pressure images, bed configuration state, and 3D joint labels for motion capture markers. This network uses an embedded differentiable human kinematics model to constrain the output to more physically plausible estimates, so that, for example, the wrist and the elbow are within a appropriate distance apart rather than being like, meters apart or just a couple, centimeters apart. And this figure shows how the 3D skeleton model can adjust for people of different sizes because the network learns skeleton link lengths in addition to joint angles. We compared our deep learning models to these baseline machine learning algorithms, which are shown here. So we compared with k-nearest neighbors and ridge regressors. The deep models, the CNNs, have lower error than these, and we also compared to a direct CNN that doesn't have any kinematic structure, and it performs comparably, but sometimes produces poses that aren't sensible. It doesn't have
Recording is on.
We used the mean per joint position error metric, which averages error over the motion capture labeled joints in the data set. So lower is better in this, and it's comparable between the two different postures that are shown, the supine and seated. And this part of it presents a method to measure the uncertainty in an inferred pose. So I want to give some context for why this is important. So generally, for pose estimation from a pressure image, body parts have more uncertainty when they are not contacting the pressure mat because there's not much information. They're not touching the sensor. For pose estimation, you can try to observe this example where a person is laying on their back and they move their arm from above their head and then through the air and towards their waist. And this produces a sequence of pressure images that are almost identical, but the poses are very different. And we can model this as a double inverted pendulum where distinct configurations of the pendulum arm exert a moment and a pressure distribution that are not unique. In cases like this, we use Monte Carlo dropout to measure uncertainty. And this works by leaving the dropout layers in the CNN on through test time, which makes the inference stochastic. So Monte Carlo dropout measures a high amount of uncertainty in the leg on the left side when it's raised off of the mat. So that's why you see it flickering around in the bottom left, because there's a high variance. But then on the right side, when the person's foot makes contact, the uncertainty drops significantly. This work has a number of limitations. All of the data consists of supine and seated postures, which are kind of homogeneous, and so overall, like the data, it's just not very diverse. And the human representation also lacks detailed information because there's only these sparse labels on the 10 joints. So now I'm going to introduce an improved method with that simple body, that blue body that I showed, that doesn't have these issues. So in this next part, I'm going to discuss simulating bodies at rest to generate data for deep learning. In this, we generated a large data set in physics simulation that has full ground truth mesh labels for human bodies at rest, and these are coupled with synthetic sensor images. We then use this synthetic data to train deep models that output a human mesh, which is a 3D parametric model. And in the first iteration of our work simulating bodies at rest, the simulator generates pressure images from a synthetic pressure sensing mat on the surface of the bed. Then the deep network is trained to infer pose and body shape from a pressure image. And our work shows how a model that's trained only on data from the calibrated synthetic mat transfers well to real data. And I'll show some examples here on the right side where you have 4 real maps on the input that have a fairly low spatial resolution, and then they output a human pose estimate, and then you see the reference of where the person really is on those quadrants. I'm noticing a bunch of noise here. I'd like to try to mute everybody so it's a little bit less. Hold on just a minute. I'm going to mute all. You can try to unmute yourself then if you need. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing the slides now. All right. Go back to where I was. Okay, so here's where I was. Great. Okay. So the bodies at rest part of the work. So this part of the work includes the following contributions. So first, a physics-based simulation to simulate human bodies at rest and produce synthetic pressure images. Also, the pressure pose dataset, which consists of over 200,000 synthetic pressure images with 3D human poses and body shapes, and also a smaller testing set with real data from 20 people we collected in the lab. We also present PressureNet, which is a deep learning model trained only on synthetic data that estimates 3D human pose and body shape given a pressure image and gender. And here's a visual outline for this portion of the work to try to make it easier for you to parse. So much of it consists of our method of generating data and simulation. This is on the left, and we use 2 simulators, Flex and Dart, which I'll explain. And then I'll discuss our deep learning method, part B, and then finally the evaluation and results. Okay, so first how we generate synthetic data. So our objective in simulation is to get this large set of resting poses and synthetic pressure images. And we do this by dropping these randomly posed ragdoll bodies onto the sensorized bed, and then generate a large collection of input-output pairs that can be used for supervised learning. This involves 2 simulations with both an articulated body and a meshed body, which I'll explain. And the first part in this pipeline is to randomly sample the initial pose and body shape. This provides a wide variety of poses and body shapes, which would be extremely challenging to collect in the real world. So like, for example, you can quickly sample 200,000 body shapes with simple, whereas even having 20 people come into the lab takes a lot more time. And the next part of this is that we drop a capsulized ragdoll body onto the soft bed and wait for it to settle. This maps the random pose to a different and perhaps smaller space of resting poses. But this capsulized body is too rough of a human approximation to produce a realistic sensor image. So then we use a second physics simulation with a non-articulated human mesh to compute the pressure image. And this mesh representation has a finer profile of human features, and it should be evident to you by looking at it why it would be more amenable to producing high quality image data. And now I want to show some examples of this simulation, just to show some of the variety that we can produce with our methods. So there's lots of different poses and body shapes that we can generate by sampling randomly. There's a lateral one, cross legs. Okay. So now the next part of the outline, I'm going to explain how we can use Flex, which is a computationally efficient physics simulator for our problem. So Flex was initially developed to simulate materials for video games. And here's a demo of Flex. It looks pretty accurate, but it's actually less physically realistic than traditional simulators that use the finite element method. You might wonder, why not just use FEM? And although Flex is less realistic, it's orders of magnitude faster because it uses position-based dynamics and it runs on a GPU, so we can run many iterations of it in parallel. So if we can find some kind of way to make it realistic enough for our purpose, it can produce tens of thousands of samples, the scale we need, in just a couple of days, rather than only like a handful of simulations with FEM. And now I want to repeat this simulation and expose the particles that are the fundamental building block for physical interactions in Flex. And these are the pieces that we use to build our bed environments in simulation. So here's a close-up of the real pressure mat on the bed surface, and also its simulated counterpart on the right side. The simulated bed and pressure mat are then modeled using these Flex particles. And our model of pressure on the mat is based on particle penetration between the top two layers of particles on the bed, so these orange and blue layers. Particle penetration is measured by the amount that a top layer orange particle sinks into the underlying 4 blue particles. And it's then converted into pressure image taxels using a quadratic sensor model. A taxel is a tactile pixel. So each orange ball sensor on the surface of this bed here produces a taxel in image space. Like most other sensors, our synthetic pressure mat needs to be calibrated, but along with the whole Flex environment bed. And the reason that we need to calibrate it is that the real bed has this fixed mattress compliance and a factory calibrated pressure mat, which are not easy to change. But on the other hand, the simulated bed has parameters to adjust the mattress compliance, and it has parameters to adjust how the sensor behaves, but their values are initially unknown. So we need to adjust them to make the characteristics as similar as possible to the real bed. And for that, we use these custom calibration objects to calibrate the simulation, which are these 4 large capsules shown here that are made from PVC pipes with 3D printed hemispherical end caps. And these are about the size of getting a call, spam call. I'm going to continue. They muted my phone. Okay, anyway, continuing. So these capsules are about the size of part of a person's limb, such as a person's forearm or their thigh. And we then placed a set of varying weights, so different weights on each of these objects, and we recorded data on the sensorized bed, which is shown on the right side. And then we recreated that in simulation, which is shown on the bottom left. So the bottom left is showing these simulated capsules. And then we ran the optimization to make the simulated environment similar to the real one. We used CMA to perform this optimization. So CMA is a derivative-free optimization method that can account for around 10 to 30 variables, which is good for our case because you're seeing, I think, 10 or 15 there that we optimize. So the optimized variables include screen constraints between these synthetic pressure array layers. So you see all the lines drawn between the particles. And these lace together the particles on the mat using stretching, bending, and shear, and also compression constraints between the top and bottom layer. Besides the mat, though, we optimize the parameters for the soft mattress underneath it to determine how soft it should be. Besides Flex, we use another simulator, Dart, which is connected with Flex. And I want to give some intuition why we need to use 2 simulators. So our human embed environment requires an articulated human dynamics model that can interact with soft materials. But on its own, the public version of Flex cannot simulate articulated multibody dynamics. But a different simulator, Dart, can. But Dart can't simulate soft things very well. So because of this, we couple the 2 simulators to take advantage of the strengths of each. So for this, the capsulized body is modeled in Dart on the left side, which links together the capsules on a kinematic chain. Then we use Flex to compute the forces on the mat, shown on the right side. And then we apply those back to the capsules in Dart, and we run this process in a cycle until the body reaches static equilibrium. And because there's 2 simulators, we calibrate them separately. And here we calibrate Dart Flex. So Dart is linked to Flex using a spring mass damper model, which is shown here. And for this, we solve for the spring coefficient K so that the Dart dynamic collision capsules displace the Flex mattress in the same way that the real capsules would. Then we set the damping coefficient to a factor of 4 to make the simulation stable. Next, I'm going to discuss PressureNet, which is the deep model that we use to learn from synthetic data, and this is a CNN. So using a large set of synthetic data, we train PressureNet, which is this deep model that inputs a pressure image and a gender, and it outputs a human mesh estimate. It consists of two modules on the top and on the bottom, each of which contain a CNN, an embedded simple human body model, and this novel PMR component. And PMR stands for pressure map reconstruction. This component reconstructs pressure maps to promote consistency between the input and the output of the network. And the way that it does this is PMR measures the distance that the human mesh sinks into the underlying bed. And this is done differentiably in PyTorch so that we can compute a loss on the output. And now I'm going to show PressureNet in action. So the first stage here computes a coarse estimate, which is a little bit off from the ground truth. And these red arrows show the difference between the ground truth and where module 1 estimates the leg to be. So it's a little bit off. But then, based on the residual between the original pressure image and the reconstruction, it fine-tunes it. And this improves the estimate so it's more coincident with the ground truth. But you might ask, how does it do that? Well, the amount of, it's coincident there. So the amount that module 1 on the top is off is the same amount that, as is the spatial difference between the pressure image and the reconstruction Q. So if you look to that Q1 estimate on the bottom, you will see that the pressure imprint is a little bit more to the right side than the pressure image, and that's useful information that can allow us to do this correction. All right, now I'm going to discuss how we evaluate this. So we generated a large set of pressure images and their associated resting poses for this evaluation. Here's some samples. It's generated from a totally random distribution. And then we trained PressureNet entirely on the synthetic data. And we collected testing data from 20 people on a sensorized bed in both prescribed and participant-selected poses. So most of them are prescribed, 48 per person, where the person mimics a pose displayed on the monitor, and that's what's being showed in this image. So a person gets into the bed and they're told, get into that pose. And we also collected participant-selected poses where the person was told to get in a general posture like supine or lateral, but they were not given explicit instruction about how exactly to pose their limbs. Great. And the last part of this section presents the results. So here's some results on supine postures. And the network has, some abilities to infer limbs that are off the side of the bed as well. So you see a lot of diversity in the limb positions, knees up in the air on the right side. Here's some lateral postures. So it's just taking as input that low spatial resolution pressure image that's in blue and red, and then it's outputting this more detailed estimate. Here's some prone postures. And here's a size comparison between the largest and smallest person and the data set. And I think this shows pretty well that the model, based on the pressure, can adjust for different sizes of people appropriately. We compared the network's performance between the prescribed and participant-selected poses, and although the synthetic data was sampled initially from a totally random distribution, the model actually performed a little bit better on the participant-selected poses. And this indicates that our simulator did a good job representing the real distribution of poses. We also compared results for using a smaller training data set size, so small data, and removing the PMR component, and both of these led to higher error, reducing performance. And this comparison is made using 3D vertex point error, which compares the mesh to a point cloud. Great, and here's the latest work that I've done, which is under a minor revision at PAMI. And this uses a depth image to infer the pose and body shape, and also to infer the contact pressure underneath a person in bed. And it does this for a person covered with blankets. Depth imagery is good for this problem because it's less sensitive to lighting conditions than regular camera images, and a camera is a lot cheaper and it has a higher resolution than a pressure sensing mat on the surface of the bed. This model infers both the 3D mesh as well as a 2D pressure image, and we can use these to localize the pressure. And this is done by projecting that 2D pressure up onto the surface of the body so we know what magnitude of pressure corresponds to what body part. And this could be used for pressure injury prevention in healthcare. I've actually filed a provisional patent on that, so if you're interested, let me know. We again use Flex to create synthetic data for this, for training a deep network by simulating blankets on the person, shown here, as well as a depth camera facing the person in bed. And here is the synthetic data generation process. So this top part, I've already explained this, so I'm not going to go into detail. That's what generates the bodies at rest and pressure images. But for vision data, we introduce a new part of the pipeline to create synthetic depth images. And for this, we use Flex, again, to dynamically model blankets on the person in bed because blankets are a common and substantial occlusion. But in some cases, like this one on the bottom, after you throw up the blanket on the body, the blanket comes to rest covering their head, which is not very likely in the real world. So we can pull the blanket back to tuck it in, or if it's not covering the person enough, we can tug on it to go in the other direction. Then we put it into a renderer, create a solid mesh for rendering, and then we simulate a pinhole depth camera facing the person on the, or facing the body in bed. And this diagram here shows two different camera angles, so from the side and also from overhead. And we'll use the overhead ones for this work. So we can watch this example. So first, the body is rested in bed. Then we generate the pressure image, freeze the particles, spawn a blanket, drop the blanket, pull it back if it's covering the head, and then wait for it to settle, and then we generate the imagery. And now I'm going to show some of the multimodal sensory data that we can generate with this simulation. So first the resting body, and here's some examples. Then the pressure image underneath the bodies. Then we show a rendering with blankets. So there's a lot of intricate folds in the blankets that I think resemble real blankets fairly well. And finally, on the bottom row is a depth image from the overhead view. We evaluate this work using the sleep dataset, which contains around 4,500 unique poses in bed across 102 different people. It has multiple sensing modalities across multiple conditions of occlusion. So we have a single sample shown here on the right side, which has RGB, thermal, depth, and pressure imagery, and without blankets, and then with two different kinds of blankets, so a thin sheet and then a thicker one. We then use this data set for training and testing our deep models, and also for initializing our simulator. So in the last section that inferred body pose and shape from pressure, we sampled the initial pose from a totally random initial distribution. But since then, we've updated this method. And here we sample the initial pose by adding noise to real poses from the training partition of that sleep dataset. So the pose from the real sleep dataset is denoted by theta R, and the initial simulator pose with theta I. And this gives us a better place to get started and just get things going in the simulator. And this diagram shows the diversity in poses that can be sampled from a single real sleep pose. We had quite a bit of noise, and we also altered the body shape and gender of the body to add variety to it. The sleep dataset has around 3,500 resting pose training samples, which arguably isn't enough for training a deep model like a CNN, but it's plenty to get things going in the simulator. And we generate around 30 synthetic poses for each real one and multiplying it out over 100,000. This is then reduced a little bit using rejection sampling from the simulator because sometimes it's unstable. But moving on. So besides having multimodal image information, the sleep dataset also has 2D key point labels on human joint positions, which are the green spheres that are shown here. These 2D labels could be used for ground truth comparison, but we wanted something better because our model infers a full 3D mesh. And you might have noticed in that last slide, I was sampling from a 3D mesh in the sleep data set, but that was actually not part of the sleep data set originally. We created that using these 2D key points to fit the bodies too. We used an optimization to fit the simple ground truth bodies to the sleep data set, right? So this provides a better evaluation of our methods so that we can compare to a full 3D mesh. These simple body annotations are called sleep 3D fits, and these are intended as an addendum to the sleep data set. And this part of the work was implemented by Patrick Grady, my collaborator, who did a terrific job with it. So shout out to Patrick. And now I'm going to explain the optimization. So here's the objective function. And one obvious part of this optimization is fitting the 3D simple mesh joints to the 2D key points. But besides just fitting those, we also have a number of terms in the optimization that alleviate depth perspective ambiguity and just generally constrain it better. So first we have the key points, right, to the 3D joints. Then we fit the simple mesh to the ground truth point cloud, penalize self-penetration of the simple mesh, as well as mattress penetration, and we compute a loss on the body height and weight using BetaNet, because the height and weight are already provided in the sleep dataset. Hold on, water. So BetaNet is a novel aspect of this work. It's a function that infers height and weight of the body from simple body shape parameters. And we conducted an ablation to show that BetaNet is important. And this example here shows that the optimization underestimates the body size without BetaNet. So the person in the middle is too thin. And then it also shows what happens when we ablate the loss on the point cloud on the right side. And it's apparent that it causes depth perspective ambiguity issues without that term. So that body's right knee is sticking up into the air rather than just laying flat onto the bed. So with this synthetic and real data, we designed a network to infer pose, body shape, and contact pressure from a depth image. And here's a function to represent it. So we have the input depth image D, the gender G, and then we output the mesh M with body pose and shape, and also the pressure P. And then we calculate the pressure distribution on the body by mapping the pressure up onto the mesh in the direction normal to gravity. And this network that does this is called body pressure WNet, which has two modules for residual learning, like the last one. The first one here learns a rough estimate of the simple body from a depth image, and it also computes a loss on the body height and weight using the same BetaNet as the optimization. So that's the green box. It uses a differentiable white box analytical model of depth map reconstruction, or DMR, to promote consistency on the inference. And this is how DMR works. So it's an orthogonal mapping between the top surface of the human mesh to where the camera is above the bed. Then we have the second module of the network, which learns the residual correction. It again uses pressure map reconstruction, PMR, which outputs P+, which is the purple image, based on the refined simple inference. But P+ is a different scale than a pressure image, and the features are also a little bit more spread out. So we pass it into this feature calibration network, which is a very small CNN that calibrates its features. BPWNet was trained with a mixed bag of both synthetic and real data at a 9:1 ratio. So we have mostly synthetic, and then a smaller bag of real data containing the entire training partition of the sleep data set. Then we tested this model on the 22 left out participants of the sleep data set that it hadn't seen before. And this includes 22 unique body shapes, around 1,000 poses, and 3 different kinds of covering. And here's some results when training a model on this data. I found that when we only train the model on real data, or we only train the model on synthetic data, the performance is so-so. But when you just mix those bags of data together in this like naive bag, the accuracy jumps by more than 30%. And it's also more than 12% better than the state-of-the-art, which uses 4 different modalities instead of 1. So it's more accurate, and it only needs 1 sensor instead of 4. And here's some results of that model. So the input depth image in each of these quadrants is either occluded by a white sheet or this thicker dark-colored blanket. It then infers the pose, the pressure, and then the pressure projection. And the projection is shown as a mirror image because it's looking at the surface of the body from underneath where the pressure is. We compared our white box method of depth and pressure map reconstruction to a learned black box model of it. And this replaces the DMR and PMR components in the network with a reverse of the input CNN, and it's structured like a UNet, which is on the right side to allow information to pass between the convolution and deconvolution, the input and the output. And I would consider this a more conventional method because I used an off-the-shelf UNet implementation for it. So BPWNet outperformed it for pose estimation, but it underperformed the black box network for pressure image inference. And I would conjecture that this is because that BPWNet has fewer free parameters in the reconstruction with DMR and PMR, and thus a tighter grasp on the pressure image formation process. The pose changes, the pressure necessarily changes. But when we project the pressure back onto the body surface, BPWNet again performed best. And generally, BPWNet can more reliably localize the pressure on the body. And this is because the inferred pressure image can be reduced to a function of only the simple parameters, where the spatial mapping is this known geometric function, which is DMR and PMR. But in contrast, with the UNet style network, there's nothing to ensure that the pressure projects well. And that's seen in this example, where with BPWNet, it accurately places a peak pressure on the heel, whereas with BPBNet, it places a peak pressure point on the underside of the thigh, which is not sensible. Now we have some failure modes. So in some cases, the model cannot interpret the image well enough, like this case with the foot on the wrong side of the leg. And it can also get confused by having the bedding under the person kind of ruffled around. So here it thinks that the bedding is the person's leg. And finally, I want to show you some demonstrations where a robot uses the pose inference from this method to move to locations on a person's body in bed when they're occluded by blankets. And this is an important action primitive for tasks in bed, like bathing or bathing the person, dressing them, or scratching an itch if the person can't do it themselves. The robot that I use for this is actually the same one that I referred to in the COI statement at the beginning of the talk, which I want to show you. So on the left of this slide is a picture of the prototype of this robot that I built with my advisor, Dr. Kemp, early on in my PhD, and it shows me teleoperating the robot to adjust my blanket in bed. This technology has been licensed to Hello Robot, and now you can purchase one. It's called the Stretch RE1. And recently I used key aspects of my thesis work to command the Stretch robot to autonomously help a person in bed. And now I'm going to show a quick demo of this, which my colleagues Matt Lamsey and Naveen Balaji set up and recorded. They did a great job of it. So here the robot uses an estimate of where Matt is underneath the blankets to know where to go. So first it goes to Matt's left knee, then it's going to come back and then go to Matt's right foot. And that rendering on the right side shows where the robot thinks the person is based on an estimate from a depth image. And now we remove the blanket so you can verify how accurate the estimate is. And here's an example that shows the importance of real-time inference of the system. So first the robot moves to the person's right elbow, touches the right elbow. Now we'll remove the bedding so you can verify the accuracy of the estimate on the right side. But now Matt is going to get into a prone posture where that same right elbow is on the other side of the bed. And so the Stretch robot is going to have to stretch more to go over and touch that right elbow again. Great. And I have one last demo which shows the Stretch robot moving to Matt's left hand and left foot while Matt's in a prone pose. Great. Okay, so the overall takeaways of this work. We showed that pressure mats are robust to visual occlusion and can be used to infer 3D human pose and body shape, despite their relatively low spatial resolution. And body parts that are not in contact reduce performance, and this is supported by our double inverted pendulum model. We showed that random sampling with ragdoll physics generates bodies at rest with enough fidelity to train deep models that perform well with real data. And computationally efficient physics engines can model pressure sensing arrays on a soft bed that resemble their real counterparts closely enough to train models entirely with synthetic data. We showed that depth imagery can be used to infer human pose, body shape, and contact pressure underneath the person, even when they're occluded with a blanket, and embedded geometric models of depth and pressure map reconstruction improve performance of our deep models. And finally, computationally efficient physics engines can model blankets and depth imagery with enough fidelity to generate data that greatly boosts performance of deep models. And with that, some publications, and I want to make some acknowledgments. So first, in all this work, I want to thank my PhD advisor, Dr. Kemp, for his outstanding mentorship over the last 6 years, and for instilling critical thinking skills in me that I think are so important for doing great research and for carrying on in a meaningful way as a human. I also appreciate his advocacy of healthcare robotics, which is an area of work that I value and I find purpose in. And I also want to thank my committee members, Dr. Hayes, Dean Howard, Dr. Liu, and Dr. Turk for their continued support and feedback along this journey. You have all been so important to me. And I want to thank my Georgia Tech colleagues for being a generally outstanding cohort of individuals. It's been such an honor to work with all of you. I've got so many other mentors and friends to thank as well, from the University of Kansas, NYU, and many other parts of my life. You know who you are if you're here and listening. And I also really want to thank my family, my parents, my grandparents, my siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles who have championed my career and who have provided a lifetime of support to me, even at times when I may not have deserved it. I would certainly not be here today or living the fulfilling life that I have without all you have done. And I owe special gratitude to Henry and Jane Evans for always believing in me up to the present day, but especially at times when I was younger and more impressionable. And finally, most of all, I want to thank my spouse, Ivy Chen, for following me to Atlanta for 5 years and providing tremendous support. It would not be possible for me to overstate the gratitude that I feel to her for it. So thank you.
Thanks, Henry. Yes, and that was wonderful. And I also want to just thank your committee too. They've been fantastic, and everyone has contributed in meaningful ways, and I really appreciate that as his advisor. So what I'd like to do is start with questions from the committee that you're willing to ask in a public forum. And after that, we'll have some time for public questions from the audience. And then finally, we'll all ask the audience to leave and the committee will meet privately with Henry. So committee, this is your opportunity to ask questions in the public. I guess just to make things easy for me, what I'll do is I'll go in order based on the images I'm seeing on my my screen here. That's going to be Greg, James, Ayana, Karen, or for everyone else, Professor Turk, Professor Hayes, Dean Howard, Professor Howard, and Professor Liu. So Greg, would you be willing to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. First of all, really nice presentation, Henry. That was terrific. I have a question related to your simulators. You're working with a DART simulator for rigid bodies and Flex simulator for flexible bodies, and you had to kind of staple them together somehow, and you did it in a way that made it work out. But let me ask you this: how far away do you think we are to having one simulator that can do everything you want? I would guess that would include being able to represent an internal skeleton and soft, skin, bone, skin, muscle, etc. And if you had such an ideal simulator, would it help the process? Would it help your research? Would you get better results?
Well, I can't speak for better results, but it definitely would have made my life a lot easier, I think. And I think it would have perhaps not hurt the results at all. Um, and your question about does that exist, or so actually, I believe that there was a paper in 2019 by a bunch of folks at NVIDIA with the theory behind putting those things together, the articulated multi-body dynamics model with the soft bodies, putting them together on a GPU so that you can run this stuff all on a single simulator. I think that they have that working on an internal version, but I believe that it just works for some like very specific environments, and it's very fragile. So they don't have a nice public API of it yet, and they certainly don't have it released publicly. So I know that there's definitely progress being made there at NVIDIA, and there's other simulators too, non-GPU based, that might also be able to simulate this, because Majoko and PyBullet are both being very actively developed by DeepMind and Google, and it's possible that you could have modeled this same thing in those two simulators, especially now with how far they've come. Because I did that simulator strapping together like 3 years ago, right? And so a lot of things have happened since then. So I think that if I had to redo the work now, I would like to think that my life would be easier.
Okay, terrific. I think actually you might be overly optimistic about state of simulators, but you know it's an opinion until one of us tries it out, right?
Yeah.
Do I have time for a second question?
Yes, I believe you do.
So I know that eventually you would like to see some of your work deployed in a setting where it can help real people that could benefit from your work. What would a user study look like, especially with your pressure network, that could evaluate the effectiveness of what you put together to reduce or avoid pressure injuries?
That's a really good question, Greg. So I think one thing you would really have to be careful about and measure carefully is, false negative rate. That's when there's really like a pressure sore there, but you're not detecting it, or even false positive rate, which would cause a nurse to try to change, move the person around to relieve a pressure injury when it's not necessary. And currently, this is the first type of work that can infer pressure from a camera, like under a person like this. So I think it has a long way to go. So I think you would have to get those numbers up. Currently, it's difficult. It's very difficult to get that to be accurate. So I think you would have to work on different network architectures and designs so that you could improve that false positive and false negative rate. I've not reported those numbers, but they are not high enough for it to be reliable in a clinic yet. And that's I think an important part that you would have to really work on if you did clinical studies, is making the network better or making the simulated data better, and just get better numbers.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all I have.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. Great questions. I really appreciate your questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. James, you're up.
Hey, Henry, nice job. I had some questions about the depth camera, things like noise model, but I found the discussion in your thesis itself. It sounds like, yeah, you made reasonable decisions there. So I'll just ask another question about the poses that you synthesize. So I like this idea of adding noise around real poses. And again, in your thesis itself, I see a discussion of, there are problems that would cause self-intersection, or I don't know, poses that go beyond joint limits, or things like that. And in the document, you say that you reject poses with self-intersections, and I do worry about that. It seems like to me a lot of resting poses would not have self-intersections, of course, but would have self-collisions all the time. And I wonder if you're undersampling places where people are tangled up with themselves, basically.
I think that's a very, very good point, Dr. Hayes. And one point that I want to make about that is that that's only being used to get the simulator going. Now, for each of those poses that are sampled without a collision, after you rest it onto the body, or onto the bed, and it comes to rest, there are usually many collisions between the body parts. And so, but by converting that from the space of random non-collision pose to the smaller space of resting poses, you actually cause a lot of collisions. However, I think that having a better human model and improving it even more beyond the simple model would allow you to have even better like modeling and synthesis of contact going on. Because right, like when I put my arms together and I touch them, that muscle tissue is deforming, and that's perhaps not insignificant. And so I think, one of my big hopes in the next decade is that we can make this simple model even better, and we can make it start to take into account, soft tissues accurately, and perhaps even heterogeneous media of the body. So you can model adipose tissue, muscle, etc., bone even better within that body.
All right, great. Thank you.
Any other questions, James?
Thanks, James, and yeah, thank you. Yeah.
No, that's it. We can move on.
Okay, great. Ayana.
All right, so I'll give you the one that's open for the public. So great job, and as you know, I'm very concerned about data bias and reproducibility. So just in general, and just so that gives you a little preview into some of the deeper questions I'll ask. But in general, how easy do you think this would be, kind of leading off of Greg in terms of creating the simulator? How easy do you think it would be to use this kind of methodology with children?
Yes, that is an outstanding question. Yes, yeah, because currently my data set is so currently I'm using the simple body. So I think that it could be improved to include a much wider range of body shapes, so more body shape parameters, and also children, perhaps even older adults too, might have changes in geometry. But it definitely does not represent the whole continuum of being a child up to being an adult. However, MPI does have a parametric body model of babies that you can download from their website, I believe. I think it was done a couple years ago. And so I would probably, if I had to do the part about children, I would probably start out with their baby model, and I would see what kinds of baby shapes it represents, and I would just move on from there.
Thank you.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Any other questions?
Yeah, the rest of them are deep
Okay, okay, no problem. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dr. Howard. Yeah, it's an excellent question. Yes, very, very, very relevant.
Great. Karen, you have the, I'm going to refrain from asking questions. I have plenty of opportunities to do so. So you get to close the public session of the committee unless there are committee members where something has popped into the brain since.
Okay. Well, great talk, Henry. And I think, people have asked a lot of great questions. Some of the questions that that was my question at the beginning. But let me just say, I don't know if it's a question, but I'm going to propose something, a new approach, and then you can tell me this is a bad idea or it's a great idea. You should have done that. So I'm not going to use Dart plus. So first of all, there are two aspects here. I'm not going to work on combining Dart with Flex. Instead, I'm going to use NVIDIA's position-based simulator, and that can handle articulate rigid bodies. They actually could do that even at the time you're working on the simulation part. But even now, after 3 years, as you said, their simulator technology definitely improved. So nowadays, you could just use robots with the soft body deformation and everything. So that's sort of the first thing I would change to your approach. And the second thing is I'm not going to use learning at all. I'm going to just optimize from the depth image or the pressure image directly to the final pose using a differentiable physics engine. And would that work?
I so
And
if you
why
could,
would the learning be better? I guess that's,
sorry.
if you still advocate for learning, I'd like to know, the reason for that. Like, why is that still better? In what scenario would be better?
I like your idea a lot, and moving towards a less learning-based approach is something that I would advocate for. Um, I, I started using deep learning. It's a great tool. It served me really well, but it's not very interpretable. And that's a big problem that I've had with it, and it's been a frustration to me. So I think if I had to go forward, I would indeed try to use optimization-based approaches, just because like I can make sense of what's happening. I can like much more easily figure out what's going on. And I think that if you want to deploy this kind of model into like a real healthcare setting, or use it either for patient characteristics, like figuring out like patient acuity, or telling a robot where to go, you want some kind of condition of like safety, right? You want to like be able to like better know like how crazy the inference is. You want to be able to give it common sense. And in these black box CNNs, they just don't offer much in that way. And so I think that if I had to move forward with this, I think dropping deep learning entirely and just going with optimization is definitely it's a very valid approach. And in now, because you can put some of these optimization methods directly on a GPU, right? And so maybe it'll be a little bit slower. Maybe it's not going to be like a fraction of a second, but maybe your inference could be like 3 or 4 or 5 seconds or something. And maybe even though that's slower, you'd rather have that sort of safety certificate, right? And maybe having it slower at that cost with the benefit of a safety certificate is actually better. So I like this idea a lot, definitely.
I was
Yeah,
hoping you would say no and then struggle and try to fight, and then we can debate. But I guess, yeah, that's a great answer.
yeah.
Well,
I've been so like
I think this is what I think. I think you could probably still do some kind of safety if at the end of your pipeline is a white box, right? Like whatever that
yeah,
black box produces is kind of rough estimate, and then at the end you can
yes.
come up with the. So I think your current pipeline is pretty good, and I was thinking that if I were argue for your current pipeline, that's how I would say I already have some kind of white box at the end.
I do have that, but the whole reason that I've got, the whole deconvolution part, I've made it geometric and I made it interpretable is because I was frustrated, like the same in the same way you were. I was like, I can't see what it's reconstructing. And even though maybe it gets like higher error, if I can see what's going on, that's okay. Like I still I want something that I can make sense of. And that was the whole driving factor behind that DMR and PMR part in the deep network. But in the same way, you could stick both of those modules into a differentiable optimization. So really, they're transferable, and you can just knock off the CNNs entirely and use those same modules with what you're saying, which is an optimization.
Thank you.
So, in defense of the work you presented, I usually wouldn't step in, but I would say I think for one thing, I would just say qualitatively, I've gotten to try out both of these systems in my lab real time. I mean, they're real time estimation based on a pressure image from my body, doing a full 3D mesh estimate, and I guess I didn't get to use the depth image, but I've seen it in real time live, people trying out. Works remarkably well, very efficient, real time. I think interpretability is great, and you could certainly couple it with having a forward simulation, especially after you're already in the ballpark basin of attraction. But I would not want, given how surprised I was at how impressive the systems were working in practice for real time efficiently, I would not be so quick to dismiss the existing solution, Henry. So I'll put that out there.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Charlie. Yes. I think that's a good point. Yes. I guess I was more thinking of like, what's the next step I would do with this? But I think that my current methods, I would like to think that so far the results that I showed and the depictions of how it performs show that it performs very well. You know, I just want something that's more interpretable because that's the one part of it that still it still frustrates me at times. Yeah.
Sure, sure. Well, you know, when a magic optimization procedure finds something, there is it interpretable? Well, it lowered the cost
One word,
through an
local minimum.
iterative process. But anyway, I said I wasn't going to talk, and here I've been. Karen, stimulating question. Well done.
Thank you for vouching for my work, Charlie.
Before we move on, are there any other questions that the committee would like to bring up in the public forum? Otherwise, we'll move on to questions from the audience. Okay, audience, thank you for coming. Please feel free to ask questions. And you can either do that by, are they able to unmute themselves or should they be putting them in the chat?
I haven't looked at the chat yet. Hold on.
We can unmute ourselves.
Okay.
Please,
so
like,
either is fine.
don't hesitate.
Oh, there we go. We got one.
Okay.
Taker.
Don't hesitate to ask questions. Don't be scared at all. It's okay. Just general audience, like, don't be intimidated. Just ask any question you want, please. Yeah.
I've got a question. So you generate this data set of poses by dropping humans on the bed. So that's kind of one class of poses. And then there's another class of poses, which is like poses that humans actually typically do when in bed. Qualitatively, how similar are these? Like, was your dropping method, did it really sample the variety of all the ways, humans sleep, or not really?
That's a super good question, Patrick. Yes, I believe that my method of just these pure ragdoll bodies with passive dynamics at the joints, I believe that they sample many of the resting poses that are there, like perhaps even most of them, because of the performance that we saw with our methods. But there's some examples that it doesn't quite cover all the way. There's edge cases, right? There's these weird things that happen sometimes when a ragdoll resting potty does not represent this kind of resting pose. And like one kind of example of such a resting pose is, say, when you are laying down on the bed and then you rest your head on your hand like this, right? So if you rest your head on your hand like this, like, you're probably still resting. Like, you would still call that, like, okay, I'm in bed resting. I'm just resting my head in my hand. And I guarantee you that if you put that pose in my simulator, 9 times out of 10, it's just going to like slip out of place, right? It's not going to, it's not actually going to stay in that resting pose. So that's one kind of resting pose it's still statically stable, right? Because the person is just sitting there resting, but it's not covered by our ragdoll body in its current form. So I think that there's ways that you could expand our simulation to, more comprehensively cover the distribution of real resting poses, like that.
Okay, thank you. Cool.
Thanks for the question. Great question. Yeah.
Thanks. Other questions from the audience? Henry, Jane?
Yes, so Henry had a question. How did you know, Charlie? Did you see us doing the board? So anyway, Henry said he had a practical question. When you use stretch to find different body parts, do you also have scratch for like itches?
Oh, that's a super good question. Yes, because I think that, itch scratching is like perhaps one of the first types of actions that, or like the first types of tasks that you might want to target with this, because basically it's just moving to a joint position and then like rubbing around the end effector until the person is satisfied, right? And so I would say that that could be a good next step for enabling that model and even that demonstration to provide meaningful assistance. It's just tell it to go to the joint and then like just move around like a little bit, a couple centimeters until the person is like, okay, I've had enough.
Jane, some people might not appreciate Henry Evans' interest in that particular capability. If either one of you could just quickly share that, I think it would be helpful.
Okay, Charlie, hang on. I was going to share it, but Henry's dying to say something. Let's see. N-E, next time you have a V-I-N-O, a violent itch, T-R-I-T-S-I, sitting on your hands, and T-W-I, and twitching you until, G goes away. Yeah. So for those of you that don't know, my husband Henry here is completely paralyzed. So that's what he depends on me or a caregiver to scratch his itch right now at the moment. And if I'm cooking in the kitchen or I'm outside, whatever, then he waits here and just basically twitches until it goes away. So he's very passionate about those itches. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for elaborating.
Yes, great question. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience?
Question. Go ahead.
Sure.
I don't know where it's coming from, but please go ahead.
Great to see you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, great presentation. So this is probably beyond the scope of your work, but so it seems like your system works really well for bodies at rest, so like sleeping. But I think people spend a lot of time in bed where they're not at rest, where there's some level of muscle activation, and I assume that the pressure map would change quite drastically, even for a given pose, just like you can imagine someone doing a push-up or something like that versus lying prone. Have you thought about how you would change your approach or how well this approach would work for those situations?
Yeah, so it sort of relates back to Patrick's question about poses like resting your head on your hand, if I'm not mistaken. But there's so many other different kinds of poses in bed besides just that one, like what you're saying, doing a push-up in bed or flexing some other part of some other muscle that changes what pressure the pressure mat is sensing. And I don't have a great answer, but I think that you would really just have to do more exploration in the real world, collect more data. Like I showed that sleep data sleep data set from the group at Northeastern that really helped me out. They have 102 people in their study, and they actually have a few of those poses where it's like what you're saying, and they sort of seem like misfits for the data set. And thankfully, they're not in the testing set really. They're mostly in their training set. But it's like what you're saying. It's like I think there's one of like a person in a prone pose that's supporting their body with their hands. And my simulation would not do that. So I think if you were to simulate that, you would have to, I would say, get the simulator going using samples from a new real data set, like the sleep data set with these different muscle activations, and then maybe you would have to use not just passive dynamics in the human body, but also active dynamics. You would have to activate the torques at the joints of the capsulized body, of that articulated body, to get it to hold and stay in those kinds of poses. Or perhaps you would just move to like a whole different like a completely different human representation, like what they have in what's that pose simulator with all the muscles that they use in anatomy and biomechanics. I'm trying to think of the one.
OpenSim?
I can't. Oh, yes, OpenSim. That's what I'm thinking of. Yeah. So some kind of open sim model of human muscles that would be more realistic and would maybe be easier to use for generating these poses that are not just passive. Yeah. Yeah. So first, collecting real data of these kinds of poses, Wayman, and then being able to simulate it. I think that would be your 2 steps.
Cool.
And I would imagine you would expect your data set to match well with people who are actually asleep and not conscious.
Yes. Yeah. So if people are asleep or not conscious or not, like they don't have a lot of physical exertion. Like my stuff works well if you don't have a lot of physical exertion.
Great question. I think we have time for one more, and then I'll ask the audience to leave, and we'll have our private session. Any final questions? Oh,
Henry, I have a very open-ended question for you. How do you think your model would react to somebody like an above-the-knee amputee or something like that?
Thank you, Mark. I was just waiting for someone to ask this question because I've been trying to brainstorm ideas about this for some time. And that is a great question. And also, thank you so much for coming to my PhD defense. So how would I model amputees? I think there's a number that is a wide open question because currently the simple body has a very limited space of human body types that it can model, and amputees are certainly not within that space, right? So what I would like to do in my future work is to build some kind of simple add-on where you can do, say, like a 3D scan of an amputee or just of that particular joint, or maybe just take a picture of that joint, and then you could put it through some pipeline or some process and sort of tweak or adjust the basic simple model so it just removes that whole part of the arm, which maybe means removing the articulations at the wrist and the hand. I think there's, I think that there's a lot of different ways you could try doing that, but that's something that I'm really interested in exploring in my next, hopefully in like my next phase of research. I've seen one cool model that uses Lie group dynamics to fit these non-parametric models to like insects, because like an insect has like a spider has like 8 legs, right? Or like an insect has 6. And so it can just automatically adapt and fit these kinds of insects and bugs that have like different numbers of limbs. And so maybe you could use that kind of adapting model to adjust the simple body. Yeah.
Awesome. Great job. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, great question.
Thank you, everyone. Let's thank Henry one last time, and then we'll have our private session. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for the excellent questions from the committee. If you would, here's what I'd suggest. Committee members, how about you get a 5-minute break while we wait for everyone to leave, and then we'll have our private session. Does that sound reasonable?
That's fine. Although, Charlie, this is only on the calendar till 2.
I did not know that. Thank you for letting me know. Okay. Well, that's I have a hard stop at 2:30, so I was not planning to go beyond that. But it sounds like we should get moving because I thought
I have a hard stop at 2 because
yes, and
it's not on the calendar.
I understand. Believe me, as a dean, I cannot. I'm sure it becomes even more imperative. So let's not take a break. And if you would, if you're in the audience, please, yeah, thank you for attending. But we've got to have our private session now, post haste.